So you might think of this paper as a sort of experiment in applied Kierkegaard. It's part of a broader project that we've recently started on at Notre Dame, Australia, on the virtues and vices of moral criticism. And my particular interest here is in the vice of self-righteousness and how it might be combated. Self-righteousness emerged as a significant sub-theme in my recent book, Love's Forgiveness, that Jeff was kind enough to mention. It emerged there as a major barrier to the capacity to forgive and an obstacle to the development of an obstacle to developing the virtue of forgivingness. But the more I thought about this, the more it seemed to me that self-righteousness has a serious claim to be the vice of the digital age. The risks associated with epistemic bubbles. I just realized I was going to share my screen. Just give me a second here. Just a sec. You seeing that all right? Is that visible now?
That looks perfect, John. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, self-righteousness, vice of the digital age. The risks associated with epistemic bubbles, echo chambers, and political polarization involve an us and them mentality in which we judge them as not just mistaken but immoral. Self-righteousness, which I think can be treated as a vice of groups as well as individuals, seems to me key to understanding contemporary social and cultural debates about such topics as political polarization, cancel culture, and declining trust in institutions. So this paper presents some work in progress, which is part of that wider project. So what's this got to do with Kierkegaard and love? Well, the first part of the paper focuses on one deliberation in works of love, the one which Rick has already referred to, entitled Love Hides a Multitude of Sins. And it also includes a brief glance at the 1843 discourses on that same topic. It then, in the second part of the paper, asks, if we took seriously Kierkegaard's description here of the one who loves, what implications would this have for our public moral discourse, especially on social media? What does it suggest about the virtues and vices of moral criticism? In particular, what is the role of the underexplored quality of generosity of spirit? And here's where my question for Rick is, I think, going to come in later on. What might it suggest about the use and abuse of the controversial category of microaggressions? In short, through a consideration of Kierkegaard's deliberation, some recent work on the ethics of online public shaming, and a heated disagreement between two psychologists about microaggressions, I'll argue that Kierkegaard's deliberation offers some prescient reminders of great significance to contemporary ethical concerns. So it's got two halves. There's a Kierkegaard textual bit and a contemporary applied bit where we hold Kierkegaard in mind while taking departure from those texts. So let's start with Kierkegaard's deliberation. Why would we want to hide a multitude of sins? To hide, we are told, means not to discover what nevertheless must be there. In this way, love is countercultural. It inverts the norm that discovery is something to be praised and admired. The world is not impressed by the one who loves, the one who finds the best in people. What it wants is the person who pretends to discover their shabbiness, envy, selfishness, and so on. Surely Kierkegaard must have had a Twitter account. What the world admires as sagacity is knowledge of evil, that which the one who loves in a childlike manner does not want to have. The one who loves discovers nothing, hiding the multitude of sins that could be found through discovery. Critics have, of course, objected to Kierkegaard here. He's sometimes overly harsh in his view of the world, But one worry has been that the childlikeness he commends, is a culpable form of naivety, a willful blindness to wrongdoing. In Love's Forgiveness, my way of tackling the willful blindness charge has been to compare Kierkegaard with Troy Jollimore's work on the philosophy of love, and to argue that their distinct but complementary views each shed light on aspects that the other doesn't. I'm not going to repeat that argument in detail today. Suffice it to say that I think Kierkegaard anticipates Jollimore's argument that love has epistemic standards of its own, and that these standards are defensible. And Rick Furtak has also done very interesting work in this kind of area. And Rick's paper just now, I think, is kind of very helpful background to understanding a line that I myself am also very sympathetic to. The central thought is that a certain kind of epistemic practice centered on factors including empathy and, especially important, we'll see, generosity of vision, provides an alternative to the standards of neutrality and detachment that are sometimes assumed, incorrectly, I think, to be the only rationally defensible epistemic standards. Some features of this deliberation, the love hides a multitude of sins in works of love, support this general thought. Kierkegaard's worry about the malignant curiosity about evil that he attributes to the world is captured in his observation that if you give evil a finger, it'll take the whole hand, an echo of his earlier thought that if you start searching for sin, you'll bring about a kind of snowball effect. That is, once attuned to looking for sins, a growing cynicism and mistrust means that you will never be lacking more and more discoveries. Part of the problem here is what Kierkegaard elsewhere describes as the spirit of comparison. Evil and sin consist in large part in what he calls a conceited comparison relationship to the world, to other people, and to become, or to seem to become, better by means of comparison with others is a bad way to become better. Seeking out the flaws of others amounts to aiming to appear good by means of a kind of least ugly contest. Added to which, we find it much easier to see the flaws in others than we do our own, an insight of the author of the parable of motes and beams that is borne out by recent psychological research on self-serving bias. But the primary problem is the sinking deeper and deeper. Like the person with jaundice who sees everything as yellow, so the increasingly cynical person becomes increasingly prejudiced in the direction of seeing evil everywhere. He becomes embittered. Kierkegaard considers three ways of hiding that what one cannot avoid seeing or hearing: silence, finding a mitigating explanation, and forgiveness, and I'll address them in turn. In the silence case, the advice is, when you discover sin by accident, keep it quiet, after the fashion of the accidental discoverer of a secret romantic relationship. Why? Again, the worry seems to be the snowball effect of corrupted character. Reporting the faults or sins increases them, because rumour, which corrupts people to become accustomed through rumour or gossip to finding out inquisitively, frivolously, enviously, perhaps maliciously, about the neighbour's faults. Now, one might want to push back against Kierkegaard here. What about the need sometimes to speak truth to power? Or cases where whistleblowing might be the only way to address malpractice? What about problematic forms of silence, like the so-called blue wall of silence, which has seen police officers cover up unprofessional or downright corrupt activities through a misplaced loyalty to peers rather than to the values of the profession? In such cases, I would propose a revised version of Kierkegaard's advice, namely a preference for private rather than public forms of rebuke where possible. Hold that thought, we'll return to it later. Some years ago, I read this deliberation in the context of another project, the Self-Love book, and balked at what I then took to be the exaggeration of the passage that's on the screen, in which Kierkegaard rhetorically asks whether any criminal is as fundamentally depraved as such a person who has made it his task to proclaim on the greatest possible scale the neighbour's faults, weaknesses, sins, to force upon everyone this defiling knowledge, even if it were the case that the evil he told was true. But now, in the context of a world of widespread social media naming and shaming, Kierkegaard's claim seems to look less extreme and more prescient. Take 18-year-old Kezia Dawn, who wore a Chinese-style dress to her high school prom and was castigated online for the crime of cultural appropriation in a tweet liked over 173,000 times and attracting over 15,000 comments. Or Justine Sacco, who became the #1 worldwide Twitter trend for a badly judged joke intended as a satire on white privilege, which was itself interpreted as racist. A bad joke that launched another Twitter storm, which got her name Googled over 1.2 million times in 10 days and ended up in her losing her job. You Google her now several years later, and you'll find that tweet over and over again coming up in the images. Such examples suggest that it is far from obvious that this kind of treatment is less damaging, less traumatic than being robbed. Might the social media pylon count as an example of the kind of slander which Kierkegaard describes as setting fire to an entire society? Slander which, he claims, is worse than the plague, and yet while we quarantine against that, we invite such slander into our houses, paying money to be infected and welcoming the guest who brings the infection. What might have been an exaggeration about the Corsair may well be true of Twitter. That segues into mitigating explanations. This is the section of the discourse that shows the clearest role for the virtue that I will call generosity of spirit, and which I'll try to very briefly sketch shortly. Kierkegaard's basic thought is that any instance of human behavior, including underlying motivations, is open to multiple interpretations, and it's always within one's power to choose the most lenient. Such an interpretation might remove what a more jaundiced eye judges to be guilt. At one point in this discussion, Kierkegaard presents love and justice as opposed categories, coming down firmly on the side of love. The quote is on the screen. I won't read the whole thing out, but the bit to focus on is this idea about the rest of us are called to be neither judges nor servants of justice, but on the contrary are called by God to love. The obvious objection is that many do think of themselves as servants of justice, to be allies of the marginalized and dispossessed. Does Kierkegaard just overlook this? Well, perhaps not. Elsewhere, he shows a more nuanced position. In The Victory of the Conciliatory Spirit in Love discourse, for instance, he discusses the need for a wrongdoer to be made aware of their wrongdoing, what he calls love's merciful blow. This must be merciful because of a risk, Kierkegaard notes, of forgiveness being wielded over the wrongdoer as a weapon. But it's a blow nonetheless, because the wrong must be made clear, at least to the wrongdoer. But by now, the discussion has moved beyond mitigating explanations to forgiveness, a key difference being that in forgiveness cases, we're in the territory of what cannot be denied to be sin. So let's not move on too quickly. In mitigating explanations cases, the recommendation seems to be a corrective to what he takes to be the societal default of giving more space and time to the search for injustice than the search for the good. So let's be clear, beyond silence, we have two importantly different cases. One's where the existence of sin or wrongdoing cannot be denied, the territory where the hunt for forgiveness arises, and one's where we're not there yet, and we should first hunt for mitigating explanations. In what follows, I sketch some illustrations of Kierkegaard's analysis and suggest some ways of proceeding that might seem more consistent with the approach of the one who loves, especially as regards how public moral discourse, including moral criticism, might proceed. A possible criticism of Kierkegaard is that he seems to overlook how negative judgment of wrongdoing may serve an important communicative function, such as showing social disapproval of wrongs. I do think that that objection has some merit, but that central to a Kierkegaardian response to this would be to say that this can be done in a manner consistent with neighbourly love, and that things go wrong when it is not. To illustrate this, I'll first reverse Kierkegaard's order of discussion and address first forgiveness cases and then seeking out mitigating explanations cases. I'll then return to this thought by considering the ethics of informal social punishment, such as online public shaming, and the controversial case of microaggressions. So first, forgiveness cases. In the case of forgiving egregious wrongs, in Love's Forgiveness, I discussed the sort of neighbour love demonstrated by someone such as Sister Helen Prejean in her memoir, Dead Man Walking, towards the death row inmates, murderers and rapists to whom she acted as a spiritual counsellor in Louisiana prisons. And for reasons that I give in the book that I won't go into today, I take Prejean to be a case of legitimate third-party forgiveness. Prejean shows an openness to seeing the good in inmates that precedes the recognition of any specific good qualities in them. And here's one of the places I think where there's an overlap with some of the things that Rick was talking about. She illustrates Kierkegaard's claim that a person's inner being determines what he discovers and what he hides, and of his idea that neighbourly love, rather than being a generic benevolence or goodwill, requires paying attention to the particular in the other person as a way of paying due respect to the idea that God gives in such a way that the receiver acquires distinctiveness. In the case of her relation to prisoner Pat Sonnier, Prejean's loving attention does love forth love, in Kierkegaard's phrase, the formerly angry and embittered prisoner coming before his execution to show apparently genuine repentance, gratitude to those who have tried to help him, and to ask forgiveness from the father of one of his victims. In expressing his gratitude to Prejean, he says, "It's a shame a man has to come to prison to find what love is." He'd have been unlikely to have said this, I suggest, if Prejean's attitude had been merely a manifestation of a generic goodwill. Prejean's love is here the catalyst that encourages a person to become a better version of himself, love loving forth love. But such love is not mere kindness. Prejean never denies that the prisoners in question deserve punishment, just not the death penalty. Her love for them sits alongside moral revulsion at their acts, but she refuses to reduce them to their acts alone. Neither condoning nor excusing what they've done, her love expresses a hope in the power of love to transform, providing them with a challenge to repent and atone, yet offered with what Kierkegaard calls the dexterity of love. And I discuss this in more detail in the book, building on Nicholas Wolterstorff's distinction between what he calls benevolence agapism, a kind of sense that of agapic love that trumps justice, and what he calls care agapism, a kind of form of agapism that has justice, a sense for justice built into it. Here's another overlap with Rick's talk. The hope in the power of love to transform illustrates the idea found in Kierkegaard's discussion of the resurrected Christ's attitude to Peter's betrayal of him. And again, I won't read out the whole quote on the screen, but zero in the bit that says, "Peter is Peter and I love him. My love, if anything, will help him to become another person." In the book, I argue that at the heart of the kind of forgiveness as a work of love which Kierkegaard praises is this generosity of vision, allied to hope, which is also rooted, I argue, in a certain kind of humility. Contrast this with the kind of forgiveness that is wielded by a self-righteous person as a sort of weapon of power. Forgiveness by its nature involves a difference of moral standing between the forgiver and the one forgiven, at least as regards to a particular wrong. So Kierkegaard insists that forgiveness should avoid humiliating the person forgiven. Significant here is his reference to the woman discovered in open adultery in John chapter 8, to whose accusers Jesus responds by simply writing on the ground. As Kierkegaard puts it, love stooped down and did not hear the accusation, or better, did not appear to hear the accusation, since once the two of them are alone, Jesus tells her to go and sin no more. In short, what is modelled here is not mere willful blindness to wrongs, but a vision that has a sense of judgment about justice and the good built into it, but which expresses that vision with what he calls the dexterity of love. The kind of unconditional forgiveness that hopes for the repentance and reform of the wrongdoer has built into it a sense of care for the wrongdoer's good, to which a sense of justice and the good, including the wrongdoer's own recognition of their importance, is integral. I turn now to mitigating explanation cases. As noted earlier, my view is that we might call the quality Kierkegaard is recommending generosity of spirit. Part of that has to do with this idea about generosity of vision that I thought was brought out in a way in Rick's paper. But I want to focus on two different, complementary dimensions of what this might involve. Joseph Kupfer has distinguished two distinct qualities of what he calls generosity of spirit: generous-mindedness and generous-heartedness. In the former, he claims, what is given is a favourable judgment. I don't think that's quite right. In some cases, it's more a decision to withhold a negative judgment, which judgment the evidence might seem to support. That is often what mitigating explanations are about. But either might involve giving more mental effort on behalf of another than is typical, being generous with our intellectual capacities, exercising powers of discrimination and interpretation in the search for a mitigating explanation. This is the opposite of what Kupfer calls a hypercritical eye or mean-spiritedness, which disposes us to overlook merits, ferret out flaws, and delight in nitpicking. Generous-heartedness is a kind of emotional giving, exemplified by forgiveness, in which, on many accounts, one gives up warranted resentment or some related reactive attitude motivated by compassion for the person forgiven. What interests me here is the relationship between generous-heartedness and generous-mindedness, which I see as one of interdependence. Largeness of emotional range, for instance, the ability to see beyond one's own resentment, often requires generous-mindedness to supply a corresponding largeness of view. Generous-heartedness, that is, often requires a mental effort to appreciate the other's worldview. This is not unidirectional. The inspiration for this generous-mindedness is typically a fellow feeling, often brought under the label of empathy, and so an aspect of generous-heartedness. So my suggestion is that generosity of spirit, the combination of generosity in judgment and generosity in emotional response, is a feature of Kierkegaard's One Who Loves. And my question now, part of this broader project that I mentioned at the start, is how might such a person engage in moral criticism? In an interesting recent book, Linda Radzik discusses the ethics of what she calls informal social punishment. She gives an account of this, which I'm only going to just briefly report on: authorized, intentional, reprobative, reactive harming, of which we might take certain forms of online public shaming to be a major contemporary instance. So I take informal social punishments to be forms of moral criticism. And moreover, I take moral criticism to mean more than just an invitation to shared moral reflection, as one account of this has it. That sounds rather flimsy to me, but to include the idea that the person addressed or pointed to is blameworthy. Radzik notes that while there is a large literature on blame as a judgment, there's relatively little on the ethics of overtly blaming people. And several ideas from Radzik's discussion aid the project of this paper. While claiming that there are some circumstances in which informal social punishment is justified, she offers several caveats and concessions that should moderate its use. First, she reminds us of Nietzsche's warning that we should be suspicious of those in whom the urge to punish is strong. Second, of Joel Feinberg's thought that the fact that someone deserves something is not necessarily a conclusive reason for giving him what he deserves. That, it seems to me, I think is a very Kierkegaardian kind of thought. Third, for Radzik, the proper goal of informal social punishment is to place moral pressure on the target to recognize their wrong and to make amends. Hence an idea familiar from the forgiveness literature. In addressing wrongs, we should not put all our emphasis on the good of the victim and the community, but we should also consider the good of the wrongdoer, not losing sight of the desirability of helping her to make amends and reclaim her place as a trusted member of the moral community, the work of love that I tried to sketch through Prejean just now. Fourth, in discussing rebukes, which she takes to involve anger targeted at a particular individual, Radzik urges a preference for private over public rebukes, which I already suggested as a twist on Kierkegaard's idea of silence. When rebukes are necessary, rebuking privately rather than publicly is a way in which love can hide wrongdoing by not needlessly increasing the size of the audience. Recall again the adulterous woman in John's Gospel, and Jesus is waiting until he and the woman are alone before telling her to go and sin no more. In finding fault with someone, better to be the critical friend whose private criticism manifests goodwill than the social media grandstander who aims to look good by comparing themselves favourably to the evil others whom they publicly castigate to an uncritical and supportive audience of like-minded followers. Shades of Kierkegaard's bad way to become better. This once commonsensical rule of thumb seems to become somewhat lost in the digital age. Interestingly, in a discussion of objections to informal social punishment, Radzik explicitly mentions the failure to take account of mitigating circumstances. The online lynch mob is not noted for its diligence in doing independent research to investigate the justice or otherwise of the pylon. And there are several important points to note here, I think. First, in the case of social punishment, unlike in a court of law, the accused rarely gets the chance to defend themselves. Yet second, there is typically plenty of scope for disagreement over the degree of seriousness of the offence, the degree of culpability of the offender, and even of whether the offence, so-called, is morally wrong at all. Often context is all, and social media is not known for its nuance. Third, there's also a lack of proportion between the wrong and its punishment. One stupid tweet and you're finished. And do offenders deserve to be condemned by a medium that never forgets? When a young sports star is fired from a position of influence for some unwise tweets made as a teenager, might not we be better off saying, let he who has never said anything stupid as a teenager cast the first stone? In short, online public shaming cannot be controlled in a way that legal punishment can. There seems to be no equivalent of the range of punishments respecting a proportionality principle recognised by the law. The mob is judge and jury. Radzik's account suggests that to be justified, informal social punishment must respect a desert condition and an instrumental condition. On the former, punishment is only justified when the one punished deserves to be subjected to coercion on grounds of culpable wrongdoing. Since one is often not able to know or even guess with much confidence how culpable they were, this is often a good reason to refrain from punishing. Note how rarely the innocent until proven guilty principle is respected in the case of informal social punishment. The instrumental condition, as noted just now, is that punishment must plausibly contribute to the goal of the wrongdoers making amends for her misdeed. This speaks against piling on once the person has already apologised and attempted to make amends, and also against so-called cancellation, insofar as this seems to recommend permanently cutting off communication with the wrongdoer, as if atonement could have no important implications for future relations. Moreover, methods of punishment unlikely to undermine the ability or motivation to atone are typically unjustified. This speaks against social media's naming and shaming, since shame is more likely to inspire self-hatred and hiding than apology and the attempt to make amends. A second contemporary example of where Kierkegaard's advice about the hunt for mitigating explanations has some weight is the controversial case of microaggressions. So let's start with some observations that I trust are uncontroversial. Despite considerable progress, racism and other forms of bias continues to blight many people's lives. These negative effects are not all the result of conscious, deliberate acts of racial discrimination and prejudice. Such racism often manifests itself in subtler forms than was once the case. Hence the idea of microaggressions, subtle slights or snubs directed towards historically disadvantaged groups, the cumulative effect of which have been claimed to have adverse effects on mental health. Many universities and corporations have therefore instigated training in how to avoid microaggressions as part of doubtlessly well-meaning diversity and inclusion initiatives. I take it that to accuse someone as a microaggression is also a form of moral criticism. The accusation assumes that the alleged offenders are manifesting racism, sexism, or whatever, perhaps unintentionally, and that this is morally objectionable. Yet the concept of microaggressions has proven controversial. In 2017, psychologist Scott Lilienfeld published a detailed critique of what he calls the Microaggression Research Program, hence hereafter the MRP, offering evidence against 5 key assumptions that it makes. 1, that there is sufficient clarity about what constitutes a microaggression to allow rigorous scientific investigation. 2, that microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. 3, that they reflect implicitly prejudicial and aggressive motives. 4, that they can validly be assessed using only the subjective reports of victims. And 5, that they exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. He also called for a pause on microaggression training programs until we become confident that the underlying science base on which they claim to be based is more robust. So I do think there's something to this idea of microaggressions. It's plausible that the cumulative weight of an ongoing series of slights can be debilitating and that this will adversely impact some groups more than others. So I wouldn't share Jonathan Haidt's view that microaggressions are, quote, the unwisest idea on campus, not least because the competition for that accolade in the contemporary university seems to be quite intense. So I'm not going to have time for a full account of Lilienfeld's critique here and the responses to it from defenders of the MRP, but I do want to tease out some details of this insofar as they provide a currently controversial arena in which to think through some of the implications of the Kierkegaard deliberation we're focused on here and the virtue of generosity of spirit. One key theme in Lilienfeld's critique concerns the unclarity of what counts as a microaggression. He objects that it's not just an open concept, familiar enough in science, but what he calls a wide open concept, such that pretty much any perceived insult or slight can be contained within its capacious borders. Examples of what have been described as microaggressions are the comment, "I believe that the most qualified person should get the job," raising an eyebrow when a member of a minority group is speaking, or a student's use of the phrase, "on the other hand." And if you're wondering about that one, I did. Apparently it's ableist, for it assumes that the norm is to have 2 hands. Even defenders of the MRP recognise that microaggressions are deniable, their very ambiguity being built into the definition. Nor, and this is again explicit, do they need to be intentional. Not intending one's remark or raised eyebrow to be sexist, racist, transphobic, or ableist is on this view no defence against being any of those things. Indeed, MRP advocates claim that such behaviours are typically unintentional. Part of Lilienfeld's policy worry is that microaggression training can encourage students or employees to interpret ambiguous evidence in the least charitable way possible. It encourages, that is, precisely the behaviour of the person who, as we saw in discussing generosity of spirit, overlooks merits and ferrets out flaws, the very opposite of the vision of Kierkegaard's one who loves. Several further problems should be noted. The MRP relies on subjective reports. A microaggression is in the eye of the beholder, who it is claimed as a default should always be believed. Second, the imposition of one interpretation on a multiply interpretable encounter, precisely what we saw Kierkegaard criticise in the discourse, falls foul of the cognitive distortion known as mind reading, where you assume, without any attempt at verification, that others are reacting negatively to you. Cognitive behavioural therapists encourage clients tempted towards such judgments to push back against their own default interpretations to avoid jumping to premature conclusions. The objection is that the microaggression training programs give precisely the opposite advice. Haidt notes that multiple forms of ancient wisdom, and he draws on here some of the biblical texts that Kierkegaard makes so much of in works of love, recognize the human tendency towards self-righteousness and the ease with which we see the speck in our neighbour's eye and fail to note the beam in our own. In a related objection, Lilienfeld complains that the MRP has failed to consider negative emotionality as a potential contaminating factor in microaggression reports, and the fact that students who score highly on this trait tend to perceive more of them and in ambiguous situations, more microaggressions in ambiguous situations. He cites evidence that such people tend to be critical and judgmental of themselves and others, vulnerable to distress, and inclined to accentuate the negative. So Haidt worries about a program that makes the most fragile and anxious students quicker to take offence and more self-righteous, training them to spot ever smaller specks in each other's eyes. The result, everyone walks on eggshells. He poses the question that I think is implicitly flagged by this Kierkegaard discourse. How can people be taught to give each other the benefit of the doubt and to cultivate generosity of spirit? In response to this, consider a defence of the MRP from fellow psychologist Monica Williams. Some of Williams' reply helpfully qualifies aspects of Lilienfeld's critique, but she also misrepresents his suggestion that it would be better to pause the widespread rollout of such training programs until we're more confident of the science underlying them, unfairly accusing him of aiming to suppress information about microaggressions. Much of her response seems to me to be straightforwardly question-begging. As we noted, a key objection to the MRP is that we need a much clearer sense of what counts as a microaggression and why, and we cannot simply beg this question in favour of whatever a member of a given group asserts. Yet this is what Williams demands. She asserts that the default response should be to believe a person's reported experience, yet conflates this with the belief that there has been, in some objective sense, a microaggression. Despite denials, it sounds like part of the point of such training, on her view, would be to encourage people to find microaggressions that they had previously overlooked. And recall here Kierkegaard's comment that start seeking out sins and a growing mistrust will give you more and more discoveries. Williams' recommendation is stark. If someone accuses you of microaggressing and you deny it, then you're gaslighting them, which it turns out is a second microaggression. Those borders are indeed getting ever more capacious. It seems to me that without the greater clarity that Lilienfeld calls for, we can expect the resentment that microaggressions trainings often inspire to get worse. Such resentment brings with it dangers too, and it's far from clear that this will aid the cause of racial justice and harmony, and so on. Such an impasse can only be avoided by honest, open, mutually respectful dialogue, not the question-begging tarring of some offenders and others as victims. Yet in his reply to Williams, Lilienfeld talks of a search for a common ground and recommends that a statement like, "What you just said is a microaggression, you offended me and should stop," is unlikely to be conducive to a two-way conversation. Instead, he recommends a response more in line with generosity of spirit. "You probably didn't mean this. What you said bothered me. Maybe we're both misunderstanding each other. I realise we're coming from different places. Let's talk." For Lilienfeld, the direct accusation of implicit racism, sexism, or whatever is a conversation stopper, not a starter. Note that this cuts both ways. If I'm accused of microaggressing, I should start from the assumption that my accuser was genuinely offended. Neither accusing someone of racism, sexism, or whatever, nor of strategic vexation should be our first port of call. His recommendation, read fairly, does amount to believing the experience of the complainant, in the sense of believing that their offence was genuine, just not accepting that it amounts to recognising an objectively existing thing called a microaggression. But consider Williams's response to the "let's talk" suggestion. What troubles me most is the explicit rejection of the principle of charity. Giving short shrift to the idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt, it's here that our recommendations are most starkly opposed to Kierkegaard's in his discussion of the one who loves. Williams considers the principle of charity to be naive and potentially dangerous, since humans behave in, quotes, harmful, deceitful, and dishonest ways all the time. what might a Kierkegaardian response to Williams be? I think that he would see her explicit rejection of the principle of charity to be a counsel of despair. It reminds me of another passage in Works of Love, in the deliberation Love Believes All Things, where Kierkegaard criticizes the attitude of mistrust for convincing itself that its withholding of trust is mere shrewdness, what the evidence supports, and that trusting amounts to taking an unwarranted risk. He calls this a misuse of knowledge. That actions and intentions can be interpreted in multiple ways does not imply that we should therefore withhold trust. Such a conclusion reveals more about a person's outlook than it does about what the evidence demands of us. We have a choice, and love opts for the view supported by generosity of spirit. So in earlier work, I've connected this with this passage to Annette Byer's observation that only when trust is to some extent already present can its foundations be built upon. If, as Lilienfeld argues, some microaggressions training programs seek to actively undermine trust between groups, then that should concern us. Williams' position seems ultimately to be this. It's up to majority group members to manifest generosity of spirit towards historically disadvantaged groups. There's no countervailing need for members of those groups to do so. Speaking personally, I thank God that black, female and gay friends and colleagues of mine appear not to have taken this divisive advice. Refusing the label of permanent victim, they are better people than Williams would have them be. Her advice pits human beings against each other according to where they fall in the hierarchies being sketched by contemporary identity politics. It overlooks research to the effect that, as hinted in Kierkegaard's discourse, credulity is often an aspect of partisanship, that we are more likely to believe our own side, whereas we either disbelieve the other side, or at least demand of them higher standards of proof. Williams' approach flies in the face of Kierkegaard's relentless insistence on the importance of the common watermark of our humanity, that each of us is the neighbour to the other. And if we support views like hers, which increasingly people seem willing to do, we should at least acknowledge that we are rejecting Kierkegaard's advice. And if we want to get beyond the position of our currently polarised societies, my modest proposal is that we might rather pay that advice a bit more heed. In conclusion, there is a risk in valorising hiding a multitude of sins and valorising generosity of spirit. The injunction to look for the best might encourage us to be blind to the ways in which things once taken to be benign are in fact morally dubious. There is something to this worry, at least at the level of risk, and that's the ground on which the MRP, for instance, pitches its tent. But I see no way to address this other than something like Lilienfeld's proposal. Let's talk. Perhaps generosity of spirit is an essential component of the virtue of what we might call reasonableness, often understood as the capacity and willingness to take the viewpoints and interests of others into account in the project of learning to live together in a complex society. One can recognise the risk without dividing the world into warring identity politics groups where we take them to be not just wrong but morally reprehensible. And as we see from the example of Helen Prejean, my illustration of the one who loves, it is possible, without being willfully blind to the worst in the other, to look for the best, perhaps sometimes succeeding in loving forth love. The attempt to do so, I suggest, is the duty of the one who loves. Thanks.